Hello, backpackers. This is Juan from Juan Backpacks, and I'm going to talk about my 5 tips for completing the Uinta Highline Trail. I actually had 2 chances at backpacking that. The first year was unsuccessful. The second year was a successful hike. So I learned a lot from the planning, through the hiking, and through kind of reflection on both trips. And I want to try to go over some tips. There are 5 areas that I'm going to cover. First, I'll do kind of an overview of the trail. Second, I'll do a preparation and planning, kind of things that I learned along the way. Gear and essentials, things I think are important to think about when you're hiking the Highline. Trail challenges and how to overcome those challenges. And then the last is kind of this hodgepodge of tips that didn't really fit into a category that I kind of threw together. You'll see me referring to my notes down here because I want to make sure that I cover things thoroughly and that I give you as much information as I have or that I've learned from doing that trail. So first, some overview of the trail. The length of the trail, as I said, is about 104, 105 miles. The total elevation gain is pretty impressive. It's 16,700 feet. It will take you about 7 to 10 days, depending on how many miles you want to go each day, and it is a pretty rigorous trail. The high point is Anderson Pass at 12,700 feet. The western terminus is 10,364 feet, so that's one of the terminus. The eastern terminus is lower at 8,240 feet. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of where you might want to start your through hike there. And the average elevation, now get this, is 10,700 feet. So really, if you look at that, you're going to be averaging 10,700 feet. You are going to be lowest point at 8,240 feet, and you go up over 10,000 pretty darn quickly within about the first 10 miles of the trail. You are cresting over 10,000 feet, no matter which direction you're going. If you start in the east, you're starting lower. If you start in the west, you're starting a lot higher. So that's kind of an overview of the trail. The preparation and planning piece. As I look through my notes here, I think that one of the things you have to try to do is select the right time to go. I would say that your best time to go, based on my research and and some feedback I've seen online, is probably mid-July through early September. I just found that July was kind of the sweet spot, and it seemed to work out well for me, with the exception of the first year I tried it. It was a high snow year, and I decided not to take my micro spikes and my ice axe. And I did need them to get through at least one of the passes. And I will tell you, those passes are very steep and very treacherous. A couple of them are very steep and very treacherous. So having micro spikes and ice axes when you go out there, this last trip, I did take an ice axe, even though it wasn't a high snow year. And I also took micro spikes. And quite honestly, I ended up needing the micro spikes in one of the passes still at mid-July. And so be ready for possible snow when you're hitting that trail, and no matter what time of the year you do it, but the prime time seems to be July through early September. Permits and regulations, you really don't need a permit to do the trail. You just hop on the trail and go. In terms of starting the trail, I talked about the east versus west. You can start on the east and you'll start a lot lower, and so you can pace yourself to go up to elevation slower, but it's still going to be quick. And so what we decided to do was spend a night at 8,200 feet, like almost a whole day in that night, and then go to just below 10,000 feet because we only went about 6-7 miles. And then we waited again. It was pretty slow, you know what I mean? It was a very slow start. And then we crested over 10,000 feet. I think that one of the things, I'm not an expert in elevation gain and what you should and shouldn't do. I just do things that work for me. It worked for my son. I actually take medication for the elevation. And so I really am not a great marker for that. But again, my son did do it, and he seemed fine with the plan, because that's what we put the plan in place for, because he wasn't going to be taking the medication that I took to deal with the altitude. I'd take it because sometimes I have had difficulty with altitude. Transportation logistics. Again, you can start in the west, you can start in the east. There are very few shuttles available. I had some people on the Facebook page for the Uinta Highline, or the Uintas, offer to give me rides to and from the trail, but it is quite a trip for folks. You're talking about a 105-mile straight line, so it's a straight line through hike. Whether you start in the east, you start in the west. If you do the entire trail, there are very few off ramps. So you got to look at your maps, make sure you plan and know where your off ramps are in case something happens. And that's what happened to me the first year. And I was able to hit an off ramp and get to a place where I could be picked up. The shuttle that I used, I think was called Mountain Transport, something like that. And I'll double check it and put the words down here. And they were excellent. I will say that it is not a cheap endeavor to pay somebody to do the shuttle, but I will tell you that because of the way the shuttles work, when they drop you off, it could be as much as a 3.5 hour drive for them. That's one way. And so I get the cost. I'm definitely, in saying this, I'm not complaining about. They did an excellent job, but it is quite pricey. I started in the east because of the lower elevation, and I got about a 30 to 1 hour trip out of Vernal, Utah, which is a great town to start in. They've got grocery stores, they've got hotels, and so that's where we decided to start our trip. One little tip that I'll give you in Vernal is that we didn't know where to put our luggage because we brought other clothing with us, and we were going to come back to Vernal because we flew into Vernal. There's a small airport there, which made it very convenient. Small, but convenient. And so there was actually like a U-Haul place that had rentals, very small indoor rentals, very secure. And so just paid, I think it was about $60 or something like that total to keep our stuff in there the whole time. And so it wasn't a bad trade-off. So we started in the east because of the lower elevation, because the access to Vernal and a great town to start in. And then we finished in the west. Again, it was a quick ride there, but it was about a 3.5 hour drive back to Vernal to get the plane out, you know, and I have a video about the number of days going in and going out of Vernal and so forth. So I won't go into detail there. But there are other ways to get rides, but that's, again, I didn't lean on that because I felt bad making people drive like 3 hours or so to pick me up. I guess you could, some folks come into Salt Lake City. I chose not to do that because I didn't think it was particularly close to any particular trailhead. It just imposed kind of this other layer of logistics that I didn't want to deal with. So we came into Vernal, or flew into Vernal. As far as preparing, I think that maps and navigation are very important. I called the Uinta Highline a trail that's trying to be a route. There are some really good tracks where the trail is extremely obvious. There are other areas where the trail, quite honestly, just disappears. There are many cairns. In some areas, they're very close together, very easy to see. In other areas, you're just kind of walking in a direction, you know, and so having some navigation is extremely important. I would urge you, if you do that trail, to have at least two pieces of navigation with you. One is obviously like Onyx or some other mapping software that has like All Trails. I think they also have the Uinta Highline on it. I used Onyx because I drew my own map and could download it then and use it on my phone. But also we had a paper map of the Uinta Highline as well. And that was nice to kind of match up when we weren't really certain if we got to an area that wasn't quite clear where the trail was. We could stop and look at that paper map. A lot of times we reviewed the paper map because it had a lot of good detail on it that we could see, and we knew where we were on the map because of our electronic mapping. We could kind of plan like what lakes we'd go by, what streams we'd go by, and kind of just look at the terrain for the next day. And so having a paper map was nice in camp in the evening just to take a look at and review things. But I think it's very good to have both a paper map and electronics. One of the other things that I did, I had Onyx on my phone, and that was really useful and it worked well. And I drew the map myself using the Onyx maps, which wasn't very difficult at all. And I planned out each day. The other thing that I did is I have a Suunto watch, and so I can load maps on here. And the reason I split up my map into day by day is that I literally loaded each day on the watch here. And so every day I would just start that up And because I wasn't using much power, this is a solar watch, that was really nice too, because worst case scenario, this thing could last really for weeks, to be honest with you, and because of the solar, and you get lots of sun, and you're in the open a lot because you're in and out of tree line pretty quickly. And so that worked well too. So I really highly recommend doing some map study ahead of time, looking for your off ramps, where, if you get into trouble, where those off ramps are, and you can kind of plan that out ahead of time. And then as well as having on trail, backups of your navigation, I think is extremely, extremely important. It is a fairly remote trail at times. There were a couple days or so where we wouldn't see anybody else, but there are other areas when you get closer to a trailhead where if you're within 5 miles or so, it seemed like there were people there. And so you will run into people along the way. But I have heard reports of folks saying, hey, I had seen somebody for 2 or 3 days or more days that have done that particular trail. So map and navigation is really, really important. Let's move on to gear and essentials. I would say that you want to stay really lightweight because you're going for 7 to 10 days. And there are ways to get resupplies in there, but it is very complicated and likely very expensive to do so. I didn't even look into it. So I committed to carrying 8 days of food, which really could take up 50% of your pack or more, depending on how many calories you're carrying and what type of food you're carrying. And so it's really important that you lighten your load and lighten the form factor of your gear so that you can use, like I did, I used a 60-liter pack, and I felt like there was plenty of room for the food and the gear, and it worked out really well. But I'd highly recommend looking to go as close, honestly, to a 10-pound base weight as you can get. Maybe it's like under 15 on that particular trail, only because you're going to be carrying probably 10 plus pounds of food to get that trail completed. And it was quite a chore to say the least. Also the weight helps in terms of the altitude. One of the nice things about starting in the east is that we hit the lower passes early. And so we didn't have really aggressive passes in the very beginning. And so that did make it easier to have a little bit heavier food carry on board and water carry on board. The other thing that I'll mention while I'm moving through this is filtration. There seemed to be plenty of water when we were there on the trail, with the exception of the very beginning of the trail. So you want to be really careful there. You want to make sure you study your map so you see where the water can be. And especially in the first, say, 20 miles of that trail or so, it can get pretty interesting, and you might have to do some pretty big water carries. I know that when I did it the first year, I had about 4 or 5 liter carries after I started out on the second day, because it was going through a really dry place. There are some springs scattered about, but they are hard to find. I found one in a meadow that somebody gave me the GPS coordinates to, and that helped out a lot in the dry section. But in that dry section, just prior to getting to some of the, I guess, the higher elevation areas, you've got to be really careful in there. Again, that's where the map study comes in and your research comes in. The food planning, as I said, was 7 to 10 days. The water filtration, I guess any water filtration that you want to use is fine. Like I said, once we got into the higher areas of the trail, definitely had plenty of water, with the exception of that first maybe 20 miles, something like that. The water filtration is, important out there because there is livestock. And so make sure you're, and they're tromping around in the water sources and so forth. So make sure you have, a good and safe kind of filtration. Bear safety and food storage. I would read the Uinta information on their DCNR or whatever they call, and they will talk about food storage. I think that just good practices as far as bears go. Bear canisters are not required. I've been in the Sierra many times. I've done hundreds of miles in the Sierra, and obviously most places I go require bear canister. A bear canister is not required at least at this point in the Uinta Highline. So you probably want to be prepared to do bear hangs. I used a combination of a bear hang bag and also lock sacks to lock in the smell, right? And so that's what I did when I was out there. And there tend to be, if you're camping in lower areas, which that's how you should probably plan your hike. I'm not going to talk about exactly where we were along the hike, but planning your hike where you're in the lower areas in the basins, and then you'll have trees to do your bear hangs and so forth. It's fairly easy. The third category, I guess, is the trail challenges and how to overcome them. So let's talk about that. Altitude acclimation. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but your average is going to be 10,700 feet. What I would do, quite honestly, is talk to your doctor before you go, talk about the altitude. I had a physician who was actually pretty knowledgeable of altitude because they had been at high altitudes in the past on hikes and so forth, I think in the Himalayas or something like that. So I would talk to your doctor. I would get some advice about altitude acclimation because again, I'm not an expert there, but know that that trail is high, and any time you can spend getting up to that 10,000 feet and doing it very slowly is really important. And that's the main reason that we decided to start in the east rather than the west. A lot of folks don't like starting in the east because they say the first part of the trail is boring. I didn't find that to be true at all. It is a heavy climb. You're going from 8,200 to 10,000 pretty quickly. I found it to be refreshing to going through forest. We saw elk, tons of elk. So we took our time and we did move really slow. I think after the first day, we sat at the trailhead for like almost a full 24 hours. We went to maybe like just under 10,000 feet the next day. And we literally got there like, I want to say around noontime or before noontime, because we only went 6 miles to get there. And then we did that on purpose, and then we waited. Again, I was using some medication, whereas my son was not, and that plan kind of worked for him. But again, talk to your doctor and look at some good resources for that and make a plan that works for you. Weather is unpredictable. That's one of the trail challenges there. I will tell you that at about 11 o'clock every day, it started to rain. It hailed at times. We had hail almost the size of marbles. It rained and rained pretty good. You would see the storms coming in and moving around the mountains because you are going across the mountains literally at a high altitude, so you can see the horizon really well, and you could see the heavy thunderstorms out in the distance. And so I would say that it's real important for you to be prepared for that cold that comes with the hail. Sometimes it was like 80 degrees, and then it would be literally, we experienced temperatures down into the 30s, literally down into the 30s. And so you've got to be prepared for anything. It's kind of like the Sierra on steroids. I've been in Sierra many times, and those thunderstorms tend to be very short, and then they pass in like half an hour, sometimes less. And then all of a sudden you've got beautiful sun and it's warm again. In Uinta, for example, one of the days it rained all day, on and off. The storms moved in and out all day. It was bone chilling cold. That was the day it actually sleeted, or I'm sorry, hailed. And then those storms lasted into the night. So good rain gear is really important. I will say that I didn't bring rain pants, but if I was to do that hike again, I'd probably bring a pair of rain pants, which is highly unusual for me, but it just would make me a little bit more comfortable, I think. Not that I was getting cold or anything like that. Make sure you have good layers. Make sure you have a puffy for the high altitude. I think that's really important. But most importantly, have good, solid rain gear that's going to protect you from that and also trap heat as well. Be ready with a tent. that can handle weather and high winds. Really important. We had some very high winds. The tent that I used was the Durston X Dome that can be reinforced with trekking poles in the vestibule area to reinforce the pole system that already exists and kind of tie into it. And I will tell you that was really pivotal. One of the nights where it rained, and it's like on and off storming in through probably till 10, 11 o'clock at night. And we felt really confident that that tent would be in good shape in the morning and that we wouldn't, have any surprises. So unpredictability of weather is really important, and being prepared for any kind of weather. Again, temperature ranging 30s, and this is July, mid-July, 30s to the 80s, and high winds, storms moving in and out. So you might have to adjust your hiking plan. You might have to slow down and wait for a storm to pass. And so be ready for that. Difficult sections of the trail. There were many exposed ridges where you're exposed to the weather. And so you always have to be, one of the things I did as we saw the storms moving in and out and off into the, miles into the distance, is I was kind of thinking as we're going across those high spots is like, what will we do if a lightning storm moved in? Where would we go? Where would we take cover? Those kind of things. So always kind of be aware as you're hiking out there. I think the rocky terrain is a big one. There's some areas where there was lots of rock and it was basically walking almost like on a stream bed. I think that the steep terrain of some of the passes were pretty significant. As a matter of fact, about 3 days after we finished our hike, I got a message from the transporter just telling us about something, that they had a mule fall off of one of the passes and actually not make it. And so if a mule is falling off of the pass, I would say that it's pretty dangerous. And then you add in snow to those steep passes, then you've got another level of things that you need to think about in terms of your safety. So I think that I'm not trying to scare anybody from doing this trail, but I think that you really do have to kind of have your head on a swivel, have your head in the right place when you do this trail. Even in the drier sections, some of those passes were very steep, and they were a lot of scree, and then there was a cliff. So if you fell and you started to slide on that side of that kind of switchback on that pass, you would continue to slide down if you couldn't stop yourself in the scree. And in the trails were not, I would say, not well groomed. That's why I say it's like a trail trying to be a route. Like in California, when you go on a switchback, a lot of switchbacks are flat, carved into the side hill. A lot of these switchbacks, you could see the trail, but there was still a lot of slant to it. And that's where I say that danger lies. And then you add snow in there. And so that's why I think it's so important. And that's why the first year I did it, I decided not to go forward, because I was getting reports of snow in a pass and I hadn't brought my snow gear at that point in time. And so I think it's rocky terrain, a lot of exposed ridges, exposes you to the weather and the elements. Again, that's another reason I think to really plan out your days and hit your markers of getting below tree line, getting into the trees every single night. The last thing is mental toughness for long remote stretches. It does have long remote stretches, and if it's kind of one of those trails, if you're into trail families and seeing a lot of people and having a lot of engagement with people, you're probably not going to get it out there. There were some lakes where we stopped where, obviously it was 5-10 miles from a trailhead, and there were people there backpacking and camping, and that was awesome to be able to run into people. But you could go, like I said earlier, 2 or 3 days without seeing people. And so you've got to be ready mentally for some of those things. And I think some people have a hard time with that. And so I think that's worth mentioning as a challenge of the trail. Now there's some other kind of tips across the board. And so this is kind of the random tips part of this. So I would say start slow and adjust to elevation. Again, I talked about that earlier, but I think I want to highlight that. And then obviously talk to your doctor about options like I do, talk to them about acclimation issues, and they can help you with that. Camp near water sources when possible. I think that's always a great idea. There are fish in the Uintas. A lot of places have trout and all types of trout. And my son and I took advantage of that. We did some trout fishing while we were out there. We took a tenkara rod, which basically comes in with the gear at like under 8 ounces for a tenkara rod and the gear we need to actually fish and catch fish. So we caught fish out there. But that's another reason to plan to be near water sources. Plus, it's a lot easier than having to carry 3, 4, 5 liters of water to dry camp. And then obviously leave no trace principles. Make sure that you're leaving things the way you left them. We did see some stuff left out on the trails, which was a little weird. Didn't really like that. You know, some of the stuff obviously was gear that people dropped, to be honest with you. And I don't think they're ever coming back for it because it's a pretty rugged trail. And I'd hate the back trail, you know, 5 miles or 3 miles sometimes. But, you know, obviously, you know, all the things apply about camping, you know, 200 feet from water, you know, going to the bathroom, doing it the right way. I think that's really important. So those are some of my tips for completing the Uinta Highline Trail. I hope you find them useful as you are, or maybe planning your Uinta Highline through hike. And until next time, backpackers, get out there, do some backpacking. Stop watching YouTube videos, unless they're mine, and watch them all from start to finish. And if you do have any questions, post them down below too. Later, backpackers.